Okay. um, the days have come in which the school is more necessary than the church. Um, that's a rather startling statement, and we could say, who would say something like that? Well, as a matter of fact, it did startle people the first time it was said over 150 years ago by Archbishop John J. Hughes of New York. And in many ways, it was his insight and foresight that launched the Catholic community in America on this great endeavor, unparalleled in the history of the church. As American Catholics, we don't realize very often that the so-called Catholic school system is actually a unique invention of the Catholic Church in the United States. In almost every other country, there's no such thing. There are Catholic schools, but for the most part, as a matter of fact, they are often enough for the elite or for the very, very poor. And that's one of the problems that we have to deal with in terms of Latino Catholics coming from South America. They don't understand what the difference is here. And we'll come back to that in another context. But from the last third of the 19th century until roughly the same period of the 20th century, the Catholic school system in the United States was the marvel and envy of the universal church. So the first Provincial Council of Baltimore, 1829, asserted, quote, "We judge it absolutely necessary that schools be established in which the young may be taught the principles of faith and morality while being instructed in letters." And then the bishops of the nation made their judgment a matter of law in 1884 at the Third Council of Baltimore. "We decide and decree that near each church where it does not exist, a parish school is to be erected within 2 years of the promulgation of this council." Now, we came reasonably close to fulfilling the goal. By the 1950s, roughly 60%, 65% of Catholic children in the United States were in Catholic schools. As a matter of fact, in the state of New Jersey, when I was a boy, 1 out of every 2 children in the state was in a Catholic school. So half the student population, and the state is roughly about 50% Catholic, which means we came awfully close to every Catholic child in a Catholic school. Yeah. Now, some American bishops, like John Ireland, opted for an assimilationist form of Catholicism, Americanism, if you will, which maintained that Catholic doctrine should be presented in a way that would cause as little difference to surface with Protestants as possible. At the educational level, the Americanists were opposed to parochial schools because it set our children apart from the mainstream of society. However, by the time the Code of Canon Law was enacted in 1917, they had to face this very strong statement, quote, "Catholic children are not to attend non-Catholic, neutral, or mixed schools." And where no other alternative was available, the bishop himself had to determine what dangers to the faith existed and then to judge if a dispensation from the law would be tolerable. And that held sway pretty much until the 1950s. In many dioceses, for example, a boy who had not gone to Catholic school would not be accepted to the seminary. And the rationale was that he's lacking the ethos. It's not simply a matter of information, but that what Rick was mentioning earlier about the cultural milieu, lacking that environment in which then to move into priestly formation. Now, the rationale behind that stringent injunctions from the 17 Code was explained clearly by Pope Pius XI in his encyclical, Divini Elius Magistri, on the Christian education of youth. Pius XI said this, "The so-called neutral school, from which religion is excluded, is contrary to the fundamental principles of education. Such a school, moreover, cannot exist in practice. It is bound to become irreligious." Now, some people have characterized this kind of thinking as a fortress or siege mentality, but few people can doubt that the American so-called public school is a potent example of a, quote, neutral school system becoming irreligious. De facto, for sure, and in many instances, de jure. Huh? Um, and by the way, just in terms of language, I made a commitment decades ago always to refer to the so-called public schools as government schools and state schools. Because the average person says, oh, it's a public school, and that sounds very nice. Huh? But the truth of the matter is, it's a state-run, government-run school. And there's a wonderful book, I think I brought it for show and tell later in the week, called Is Public Education Necessary? And it's by a non-practicing Jew, Samuel Blumenfeld. And if you don't want to read the whole book, just go to the last paragraph of the book. And he said, so, to answer our question, are public schools necessary? The government, he says, belongs involved in education as much as it belongs involved in starting churches, because both are involved with forming men's minds and hearts, not the job of government. All right? Then the fathers of the Second Vatican Council dealt with education, Catholic education, extensively, as they followed the trajectory of church teaching to that point and then contributed to it as well. It's remarkable, if you think about it, that Vatican II was the first council in the history of the church to produce a document on Catholic education. Now, in all likelihood, one of the reasons for that is some of these things were just sort of taken for granted. It was the way things were. But by the time we get to the 20th century, the church sees it as extremely important to highlight the significance of the Catholic school. And so in Gravissima Educationis, the Declaration on Christian Education, we read this. The church's involvement in the field of education is demonstrated especially by the Catholic school. Therefore, since it can contribute so substantially to fulfilling the mission of God's people and can further the dialogue between the church and the family of man to their mutual benefit, the Catholic school retains its immense importance in the circumstances of our times too. As for Catholic parents, the Council calls to mind their duty to entrust their children to Catholic schools. Their duty to entrust their children to Catholic schools. And we can observe these statements are rather absolute. They're not surrounded by various qualifiers. Huh? In 1971, the American bishops issued a pastoral letter on Catholic education to teach as Jesus did. And it became the standard by which to judge all Catholic schools, outlining as it did the goals and objectives for all Catholic institutions of learning. And we find the following statement. These schools are the most effective means available to the church for the education of children and young people. Now, there's a great irony in the presentation of this document, 1971. So the bishops have said this, but in 1971, back home in their dioceses, bishops were closing Catholic schools at the rate of one a day. And there's a book produced by a priest from the Richmond diocese, Stephen, it'll come to me, but it's called Mixed Signals. And it's relating to this precise point, that at a public level, the Episcopal statements are grand support for the schools, but at the practical level, it's you're on your own. If you can float, fine, and if you can't, that's your problem. Pope Paul VI's bicentennial message to the Church in the United States contained praise for the American Catholic school system and an encouragement to continue the tradition. He wrote, "The strength of the Church in America is in her Catholic schools." And it wasn't sheer coincidence that the two Americans that Paul VI canonized in connection with our bicentennial, Bishop John Neumann of Philadelphia, or as the Philadelphians call him, Newman, and Mother Elizabeth Seton of New York, were prime movers in the parochial school effort. Coincidentally, the nuns I had from kindergarten to 5th grade were Mother Seton's Sisters of Charity, and the nuns I had from 6th to 8th grade were John Neumann's Franciscan Sisters of Philadelphia. But the two and if you look at actually all of the American saints to this point, just about every one of them was involved in Catholic education. A very thorough analysis of Catholic education in modern times was offered by the Sacred Congregation for Catholic Education in 1917. A very clever title for the document, The Catholic School. Probed every aspect of the educational process and also recognized the fact that some people had suggested the phasing out of Catholic schools. And what's the conclusion of the document? To give in to them would be suicidal. A very telling remark, huh? Pope John Paul II's esteem for American Catholic schools was demonstrated with great regularity. Just months after his installation, he sent a videotape message to Catholic educators gathered in Philadelphia for the annual convention of the National Catholic Educational Association, in which he said, quote, "I hope to give a new impulse to Catholic education throughout the vast area of the United States of America. Yes, the Catholic school must remain a privileged means of Catholic education in America, worthy of the greatest sacrifices." And then later that year, during his first pastoral visit to the States, with 20,000 Catholic high school students at Madison Square Garden, he seized the opportunity, in his words, to tell you why the church considers it so important and expends so much energy in order to provide millions of young people with a Catholic education. It is for no other purpose than to communicate Christ to you. And he often referred to the Catholic school as the very heart of the church. Pope Benedict XVI, in his visit to America in 2008, and the lecture he gave at Catholic University in Washington, he weighed in as well. He said, "Dear friends, the history of this nation includes many examples of the Church's commitment in this regard. The Catholic community here has in fact made education one of its highest priorities. This undertaking has not come without great sacrifice. Towering figures like St. Elizabeth Ann Seton and other founders and foundresses, with great tenacity and foresight, laid the foundations of what is today a remarkable network of parochial schools contributing to the spiritual well-being of the Church and the nation. Countless dedicated religious sisters, brothers, and priests, together with selfless parents, have, through Catholic schools, helped generations of immigrants rise from poverty and take their place in mainstream society." He goes on, "This sacrifice continues today. It is an outstanding apostolate of hope, seeking to address the material, intellectual, and spiritual needs of over 3 million children and students. It also provides a highly commendable opportunity for the entire Catholic community to contribute generously to the financial needs of our institutions. Their long-term sustainability must be assured. Indeed, everything possible must be done in cooperation with the wider community to ensure that they are accessible to people of all social and economic strata. No child should be denied his or her right to an education in faith, which in turn nurtures the soul of a nation." Now, of course, here's a man who speaks with incredible clarity. And just to pull out a few particular threads here, he talks about historically how the schools served as a vehicle for assimilation and integration of the children of immigrants. I consider myself Exhibit A. My grandparents came here from Ukraine and Lithuania. My parents got a high school education. I'm the grandson of immigrants. I have 2 doctorates. Right? And it all happened precisely because of the Catholic school system. I mentioned earlier about Latino Catholics. This is a source of great, great concern to me. Cardinal O'Malley makes the point that he finds it very disturbing that there are more Black Baptists in Catholic schools than there are Hispanic Catholics. And this is the first time in American church history that the institutional church has neglected the Catholic education of an entire massive group of immigrants. And then we wonder why 50% of Hispanic Catholics defect to Protestant sects, and why the number of vocations to the priesthood and religious life is as minimal as it is from the Hispanic community. it's not the fault of the Hispanic Catholics, it's the fault of bishops and pastors who have not made the Catholic education of Hispanic children a priority for the entire Catholic community. Huh? And when Archbishop Laghi was our nuncio, of course, he had been nuncio in Argentina before coming here, and he lambasted the bishops at one of their national annual meetings, saying, "You have abandoned these children to the sects." And of course, we see this in spades now. The other issue with Hispanics in regard to Catholic education, as I mentioned, they're coming from a different framework. And the first is a lack of perception about what really goes on in the government schools of the United States. They're used to public schools in Latin America, many of which, like some of the countries of Europe, where religion is taught in the government schools. And so they don't even understand how bad the situation is in the government schools here. And then secondly, they presume that these schools are out of reach financially because in their home countries, for the most part, they are academies for the elite. A friend of ours who was a seminarian in Argentina for a number of years and then left and got married and had kids, at one point I said to him, he goes to daily mass, and I said, "Fernando, why are your children not in Catholic school?" And he said, "Well, where is there one?" I said, "You go to mass at St. Veronica's, right? What do you think that first building is on the campus?" He had no idea that that was a parish school. I also make the point, check your websites. It was one of the questions on the questionnaire that some of you failed to respond to, by the way, that do you have, is the school on the parish website, right? Many of these places it's not. The school may have its own website, but what's that do? That dissociates it from the life of the parish, right? And particularly where you have the situation of a regional school or an interparochial school, right? Then that's completely off on its own. It's not on the bulletin, it's not on the website, and therefore it doesn't exist. Now, at times, some Catholics that would consider themselves traditional and are critics of contemporary Catholic schools will agree that Catholic schools were certainly superb in the good old days, but not so anymore. And while some horror stories about bad catechesis and poor attitudinal formation are regrettably accurate, it's also important to underscore two other points. Number one, the local government school isn't going to be any more Catholic for sure, right? And secondly, in spite of deficiencies which surfaced in some places in the 70s, for example, Catholic elementary and secondary schools today are on the rebound in terms of reclaiming a truly Catholic identity, to which I can personally attest because I spend the vast majority of my time working with schools on this matter. And later this evening when we talk about Catholic identity, I'll mention that. A third issue to consider is that socialization and identification with the so-called institutional church are key for an incarnational religion like Catholicism, in which structures are critically important. So, and this issue needs to be addressed to proponents of homeschooling. Homeschooling has not achieved that goal and can't do so, in spite of good intentions and goodwill. And all of this has been documented both statistically and anecdotally. And furthermore, sociological surveys consistently show that the graduates of post-Vatican II Catholic schools continue to be markedly different from their public school counterparts, especially in terms of Sunday Mass attendance, thoughts on abortion, willingness to consider a priestly or religious vocation, and generosity to the local parish, both in terms of service and donations. At yet another level, the success story of Catholic schools occurs with phenomenal regularity in the academic realm. Professor John Coleman of the University of Chicago documents an impressive performance record for Catholic high school students, which indicates that they outstrip not only public school students, but also, and amazingly so, students from private schools. And the reason for the success, according to Coleman, it happens because of religious and moral values in our schools and because of the coordination between home and school. A point consistently highlighted by Pope Francis, himself a former high school teacher. And these two aspects certainly take on the greatest significance when we reflect on the incredible achievements of youngsters in inner city Catholic schools. But in terms of the suburban phenomenon, this is important. There's a film which I will make available to you later in the week that documents the abysmal failures at an academic level of suburban government schools. For the past couple of years, I've been doing some adjunct teaching at a community college. And I've been, I guess, living in la-la land for too long. I mean, I've regretted the dumbing down of academic standards in Catholic schools. 95%, 98% of students I teach philosophy, world religions, and Latin. 98% of them are graduates of public schools in suburbia. In a political philosophy lecture 2 years ago, I began by asking if they knew the difference between a statesman and a politician. Blank. I said, well, let me give you an example of a man who's generally considered to be a statesman. I said, I have some problems with him because of what he did to Eastern Europe, but Winston Churchill. A class of 32 students, gentlemen, not one had ever heard of Winston Churchill. Right? Last year, same class, same subject, I said, this is the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta. Kid said, Mahu? I said, Magna Carta. No one had heard. I said, King John, Runnymede, English common law, blank, nothing, never heard of it. I'm forced by the school to give them 2 writing assignments. I want you to know I have absolutely no time in purgatory left because to read these is a constant crucifixion, right? There's no coherent sentence. They don't know the difference between a subject and a verb. But having taught English and Latin for 100 years, I can't miss the opportunity to correct what they do. So there's more red on the paper than there is black. And I make a laundry list of everything. And when I hand back the papers, I say, you had a run-on sentence. You had a split infinitive. Split what? No idea. And one kid yelled out, is this an English class or a philosophy class? I said, it's called education. I said, and I shouldn't have to be doing this for sophomores in college. And one kid yelled out, well, where did you learn all of this? I said, in 3rd grade. And then one kid said, we really were cheated, weren't we? And again, this is one of the arguments that we often get, and one of you put on your questionnaire that people are saying, we have very good public schools. Well, test the water, make sure you...
If you don't mind the interruption, I've served as a scoutmaster in the same town I was talking about, of course, where I lived, for 10 years. And I get a lot of writing from the kids. 10 years is not so long that I've become an old fogey and am judging them with different eyes. There is a precipitous difference between students from the good suburban government schools writing in this Boy Scout troop. Most of them go to the government school versus today. And the few that I have who've gone to our Catholic schools do better. There's been a decline there too, but better, markedly better.
Yeah.
But it's pretty abysmal, and this is a very high performing school district where kids will go to BC, for example.
There is a book, and I will show you a review of it, by Mark Bauerlein, who's one of the editors of First Things, Catholic convert. But the book is called The Dumbest Generation. And he has just assembled all of the idiocies that this generation accumulates. And I say to these college kids, I tell them about the book, and I say, now I want you to understand, I'm not blaming you. This is not your fault, all right? I said, you don't know anything because most of your teachers didn't know anything. And one kid yelled out, you've been to my high school, I bet. But the kids themselves know that it's abysmal. And I say to them, if you want to use this course to help play catch-up ball, I'm more than happy to do that with you and for you. And interestingly enough, the president of the college tells me that I have one of the highest student evaluations of any professor in the school. It's interesting also, my first day on campus, I'm walking across and I hear one kid yell, hey, what happened? And he said, what do you mean? He said, there's a priest. Did somebody die? Again, you see the total disjunction, right? What's the priest? The god of the gaps. Yeah? Oh, it must have been a crisis, because what the heck would a priest ever have to do with education? So you can see there also another whole issue that's involved. A few minutes ago, I referred to that encyclical of Pius XI, in which he pointed out the basic fatal flaw in state-controlled education. Let me highlight for your consideration what goes on and doesn't go on in the so-called public schools. One, God talk is forbidden. Religion is either ignored or attacked. Immoral sex education is imparted at the youngest ages. Abortion is promoted. Condoms are distributed. And then until recently that the Trump administration revoked the Obama transgender bathroom mandate. And still more, the latest and most disturbing data to surface, and we alluded to this at dinner, that Catholic children who attend the government schools lose their faith in God and the church as early as age 10, due precisely to the science that they are taught. There's a recent CARA study, Center for the Applied Research in the Apostolate, just produced a massive study documenting this linkage. And it's very, very important to understand this. Conversely, I was doing an assessment of one of the high schools in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles last August, the beginning of the school year. And I walked in, and the teachers generally don't know that I'm coming. I walked into a freshman science class. It's a girls' high school. And the teacher, it was again the first week of school, and the teacher was beginning to explain the scientific method. And he did a very, very good job. And as soon as he finished that, he said, but now, ladies, understand something. The scientific way of thinking and viewing reality is one way. He said, there's also the way of philosophy. There's also the way of theology or faith. And there's the way of the heart. And he said, no one of these by itself works. And all of them have to work together. Well, that's exactly what kids need to hear. Turns out, by the way, the man is not a Catholic even. An evangelical Christian, science teacher in a Catholic girls' high school. And in my report, I highlighted him. I said, this is exactly what needs to be going on. And it's the integration of everything. So, we're not fundamentalists. We don't deny the scientific method, but we say it's one piece of the bigger picture. And so I think, again, as pastors, you have to be comfortable in challenging your people and saying, do you want your children exposed to that kind of an education? And most pastors shy away from the discussion because priests by nature are avoiders of conflict. Priests like to be loved. And so you don't say anything that's going to rock the boat or that may potentially hurt the collection. And of course, there are powerful counterforces in all these parishes, because you have the CCD lobby that have made a whole career out of something that takes place 1 hour a week. You have Catholic parents who are resolutely committed to using the government schools, and you have Catholic teachers teaching in the public schools. Some years ago, I was preaching at a parish in the Archdiocese of Denver, and halfway through the homily, an entire pew got up and walked out. And I said to the pastor, I said, "Who was that?" And he said, "The principal of the local public school." But again, if we're not prepared to say this, then we can't expect people to spend thousands of dollars on something if, well, we have a nice school, and there's a statue of Our Lady in the classroom, there's a crucifix on the wall, and we would encourage you to, Catholic Schools Week we'll talk about it and say it's a nice place to be. That's not going to cut it, right? We have to show the stark difference, and again, later when we start talking about identity. But then Pope Benedict also talks about the responsibility of the entire Catholic community to support Catholic education, right? It's not the responsibility of parents who happen to have their kids in Catholic school. It's not the responsibility simply of a parish that happens to have a school on its property, right? It's the responsibility of the entire Catholic community. And I always say to senior citizens, you probably received a Catholic education for free, your children perhaps for a pittance, and now people are given an almost unsustainable burden to have to pay for this. I think about the high school that I went to. When I started freshman year, the tuition was $150. When I finished, it was $300, and last year it was $12,000. And if we're talking about A, the Catholic parents ought to have kids, and B, that they ought to be in Catholic school, well, if you have 3 or 4 kids, you're talking about $50,000, $60,000, right? And this is unconscionable. And then the Pope goes on to say, no child should be denied his or her right to an education in faith. Right? And then notice the last line, that education in faith, which in turn nurtures the soul of a nation. He's immediately connected the social implication of Catholic education. And that's something else we'll talk about on Thursday, is how to present the school to the community at large. And one of the things is to say, we're going to be the only game in town, right? Because these other kids are not getting anything. When I was administrator of the lone Catholic high school in the state of Idaho, I got a call one day. Secretary said, the president of Bon Marché, which is their equivalent of Macy's, is on the phone, wants to talk to you. And I said, oh no, did one of our kids get caught shoplifting? and I knew that the man was also a Mormon bishop. And with trepidation, I picked up the phone. He said, Father, I was wondering if you would publicize the fact that we're looking for high school kids to work summer jobs at our department store. And I said, oh. And I said, are you sending this out to all the high schools in the city? He said, oh, gosh, no. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I don't want those kids. He said, I want Bishop Kelly kids. And I said, why? He said, they're respectful and respectable. They're honest. They know how to dress. They can work. They can obey. And I said, oh. I said, would you be willing to write that in a letter to me? And he said, sure. Which I then photocopied and sent to all the parents. And one of them happened to go to the local newspaper and put it, and all hell broke loose in the city because it was considered an attack on the wonderful public schools of the city of Boise. But this man saw the benefit. And the nun who was the head of our business department, she would go around to all the businesses and ask them to buy typewriters and whatever. This was in the late 70s, early 80s. And they'd say, well, why should we do that, sister? Because our graduates are going to be helping you maintain your businesses. And yeah, they produced. Did you have something to say, Charles? Or?
No.
Oh. So the responsibility of everybody. And I firmly believe that K to 12 Catholic education ought to be tuition free. Everybody is entitled to it, and if everybody were paying into it, we wouldn't have this problem. I always give the example of the Diocese of Wichita, all right? Where K to 12 education is completely free, the schools are full, and that little diocese this past year ordained 10 men, is ordaining 10 the following year as well. And I say, if little Wichita can afford to educate all of their children for nothing, how come the rest of us can't? And it's a lack of will, that's all, right? And it's very, very simple, they say. They have a stewardship model for the whole diocese, and integral to being a practicing Catholic is the right that you have to give your children a Catholic school education. It's as simple as all of that. And interestingly enough, of course, if people are donating to the parish, that's tax deductible. The tuition, hypocritically, is not tax deductible, right? So there's even a motivation there at a practical level to adopt that model. And sometimes pastors will say, I think it's a great idea. I wish the diocese would do it. You don't need the diocese to do it. Do it yourself, all right? Right? No reform in the church ever took place from the top up or top down. It's always bottom up, right? So if it's a good idea, do it. Nobody's going to stop you. Then the church in the United States responded to an anti-Catholic threat in the 19th century by fashioning her own school system. And that school system has served both the church and society, the broader society, very well. Now, there's a new form of anti-Catholicism today, not of Protestants against Catholics, not for the most part anyway, but of virulent secularists against all people of faith. And so that fact forces me to repeat, Catholic schools are more necessary today than they ever were before in our history. That kind of aggressive secularization can only be held off and even reversed if the church is able to offer her members an alternative vision of life, what sociologists call a viable subculture. Truth be told, the Catholic subculture is the real culture, while what society is offering is no culture at all. And in essence, that's what St. Benedict did. You hear people now talking about the Benedict option, which is some crazy ideas about that means going into a rabbit hole somewhere. But what Benedict did, as the decadent Roman culture was breathing its last, his alternate vision saved not only the church, but all of Western civilization. The principal agent of the Benedictine renewal was a monasticism that founded schools everywhere they landed. And what emerged in relatively short order was the glorious Middle Ages, the age of faith, with the good, the true, and the beautiful producing a superabundance of magnificent works of literature, art, music, architecture, and guess what? Thousands of saints. Yeah. Believers have to be convinced, and then have to convince everybody else, that the Fathers of Vatican II got it right in Gaudium et Spes when they said, without the Creator, the creature vanishes. Without the Creator, the creature vanishes. And history supports that assertion, huh? Just look at the bloodshed of every godless movement of modernity, from the French Revolution to the Mexican Revolution, the Spanish Civil War, the murderous campaigns of the Nazis and the communists. Clearly, without the Creator, the creature vanishes. And an education devoid of God is an anti-education. An anti-education. Let me conclude this section with a very insightful observation of Thomas Merton, found in his Seventh Story Mountain. Reflecting on some years of his boyhood spent in France between the two world wars, he contrasted the state school in the village with the Catholic one. Now remember, he was raised as a quasi-atheist, certainly an agnostic. Right? But he says, when I think of the Catholic parents who sent their children to a school like that, meaning the public high school, I begin to wonder what was wrong with their heads. And this is in 1930, right? Down by the river, in a big clean white building, was a school run by the Marist fathers. I had never been inside it. Indeed, it was so clean it frightened me. But I knew a couple of boys who went to it. They were the sons of the little lady who ran the pastry shop opposite the parish church. And I remember them as exceptionally nice fellows, very pleasant and good, and how unlike the products of the lycée they were. When I reflect on all this, I am overwhelmed at the thought of the tremendous weight of moral responsibility that Catholic parents accumulate upon their shoulders by not sending their children to Catholic schools. Those who are not of the church have no understanding of this. They can't be expected to. As far as they can see, all this insistence on Catholic schools is only a money-making device by which the church is trying to increase its domination over the minds of men and its own temporal prosperity. And of course, most non-Catholics imagine that the church is immensely rich and that all Catholic institutions make money hand over fist, and that all that money is stored away somewhere to buy gold and silver dishes for the Pope and cigars for the College of Cardinals. Now, of course, with Dolan with the cigars, this could be the case, but it goes on. Is it any wonder that there can be no peace in a world where everything possible is being done to guarantee that the youth of every nation will grow up absolutely without moral and religious discipline and without the shadow of an interior life or of that spirituality and charity and faith which alone can safeguard the treaties and agreements made by governments? And Catholics, thousands of Catholics everywhere, have the consummate audacity to weep and complain because God does not hear their prayers for peace when they have neglected not only his will, but the ordinary dictates of natural reason and prudence, and let their children grow up according to the standards of a civilization of hyenas. A civilization of hyenas, right? That's a rather stark message, huh? And it's interesting, when I preach that, invariably, at least one person at every Mass says, Father, I found that one sentence very offensive. Civilization of hyenas. I don't think my children are hyenas. It obviously strikes a chord, right? But that's exactly what's being produced, huh? So, I like to say we need to revive the spirit of 1884. And the motto of 1884 was every Catholic child in a Catholic school. When Bishop Hebda was the Bishop of Gaylord and Charles was his superintendent, there was a significant move on the part of many to close some of the very small rural schools. What was one of them, like 60 kids or something? And Bishop Hebda said, well, I did some research on the history of these places. When that school opened in 1910, there were 20 kids in it. So it's tripled its enrollment. Right? And also, we have to think outside the box. There's no need that we be in lockstep K, 1, 2, 3, 4. Children don't learn. Every first grader is not at first grade level in math and in language arts at the same time. You can have, grades 1, 2, and 3 in the same room even, for heaven's sake. And you have some kids that are at this level for this subject and some kids at a level for another. And some kind of creative educational system. But it's all doable. And I always say to people, our problem is not money. Our problem is faith. These institutions, for the most part, were built by penniless immigrants. Right? My own grandmother raised 3 kids by herself during the Depression. She made $5 a week, and she gave $2 a week to the church. And I said, Grandma, how did you do this? She said, the Father said we have to build a school, we have to build a church. Who's to do it? We have to do it. Right? She believed. Right? And now We have the most affluent Catholic population in the history of the world that can't maintain the institutions that were built by immigrants. Gentlemen, the problem is not money. The problem is faith. All right? On one of my trips to Los Angeles 2 Januaries ago, I got on the airplane in Newark. I was sitting there and people were coming in. As a family came in to sit in front of me, the man sort of nodded at me, acknowledged and smiled and sat down. And then, as we landed in LA, we're all standing waiting to get out, and we discovered that they can't open the airplane door. So we're standing there, and people then start to talk to each other. And so the man turned to me and he said, Father, do you live in California or New Jersey? And I said, New Jersey. And I said, you? And he said, yeah, we live in Jersey too. And I said, is LA your final destination? And he said, no, we hope to get the connecting flight to Hawaii. We're going on a winter vacation for the family. I said, oh, that's very nice. I said, where are you from in Jersey? He said, Rumson, a neighborhood familiar to Rick. I said, oh, Holy Cross Parish. He said, yes. Now understand, the poor people in Rumson live in $1 million homes. And I said, oh, Holy Cross, Rumson. Do your children go to Holy Cross school? And he said, no. And I said, oh, where do they go? He said, they go to the local public school. And I said, and why would that be? And he goes, I said, really? I said, I find that fascinating. Oh, why is that, Father? I said, because the last time I checked, the tuition at Holy Cross School is $5,000 with a family rate. It's a blue ribbon school. And what was the third reason I gave? And he said, and I said, oh, and the third, I said, I was never a math major, but I've been doing some quick math here, and my guess is that this vacation is going to cost you about $30K. And he said, well, Father, I said, I do, and that's the problem. That ended the conversation. But I say to myself, where was his pastor? You see? Where is the pastor to say, you people have screwed up priorities, all right? You're taking a Hawaiian vacation, but submitting, and you don't have the money to put your kids in a Catholic school. And he only had 2 kids. So even if they were $5,000 each, all right, it was 1/3 of their vacation, all right? But again, we're afraid to say that because someone's not going to like me anymore, right? And so there needs to be a strong element of courage in all of this. I don't know if any of you watched some of those presentations at that Orlando event a couple of weeks ago. And one of the men who spoke, I only caught a couple of the talks, but I thought, oh, this is going to be, one of these, personality development things or whatever, and prosperity gospel kind of thing. And he began, with the requisite jokes. But then he said, here are some keys to leadership. And he had a pyramid, and the bottom brick, the first brick, was trust. He talked about the importance of trust, that the leader has to trust his team, and the team has to trust the leader. And he said, the next brick is conflict. And he said, and boy, you priests and bishops, you hate conflict. He said, and because you hate conflict, you end up in more conflict than anybody else. Right? He said, and let me give you an example. He said, you have a parish council meeting. He said, and some ditzy woman, and he says, and yeah, I'm sorry, it usually is a woman. He said, ditzy woman gets up and says, I think we ought to have a balloon festival next summer for the parish. He said, now everybody at the table is going, nutty, okay? But nobody says anything. So she waxes on eloquently about all of the value of a balloon festival. And the pastor says nothing. And finally, he says, does anybody have any comments for Mabel about the balloon festival? No, no. Well, let's put it to a vote. And so unanimous, Mabel, if you're willing to do the balloon festival, it's on. And so they have the balloon festival. It's a total bust. Nobody was interested in it. It didn't make any money. Nobody knows anything that had to do with evangelization or anything else. And so she comes back after the balloon festival, makes a report to the parish council, and says it was a grand success and we ought to do it next year. And everybody says, oh, okay. And then he says, but then you get in the parking lot and everybody says, that woman is a nut. Right? He said, but you know why no one tells her she's a nut? Because no one has trust. You don't have enough trust in each other that you can be honest with someone. And so you let a nut continue to grow even nuttier. and everybody laughs at it because it's so true. I mean, and you see it constantly. But when it comes to the issue of Catholic education, we have exactly the same problem. We all know what the truth is, but most people are terrified to say it. A young priest told me he recently became administrator of 2 parishes. One has a school, the other does not. The DRE in the one parish makes $59,000. We wonder why our institutions are going down the bowl. $59,000 to conduct, felt banner workshops, for first communicants. This is insane, right? And he said, he questioned people and said, he's only there a month. And he said, why are we paying her that? Oh, well, she's very effective. Well, how is she effective? What is the effect of what she's doing? And $59,000? This is lunacy. And of course, we also have to admit that the bureaucracies in most parishes is so bloated. I mean, the 3 times that I was a pastor, first thing I did is got rid of all paid personnel the first month. Gone. Everything, volunteers. Cleaning, bookkeeping, everything. And I ended up getting some of the best people imaginable, tremendous competence, right? And all the budget completely redirected. But a lot of priests and bishops have abandoned the spiritual model of being a pastor and have opted to be CEOs. And they're darn bad CEOs too, okay? And so instead we have this model, so I need a big team so that I can feel important, right? I have a staff meeting on Monday mornings, right? The bereavement counselor, the liturgist, the this, the that. And here I am presiding over the whole thing, which of course it's all going down the bowl in the process anyway, right? And the other thing that we have to be cognizant of, the money is drying up, right? And it's drying up for a number of reasons. A priest who taught me in high school ended up pastor of the first canonically erected senior citizen parish in the world. Right? He went there in about 1992. He had 3,000 people in the parish, not families, obviously these are mostly couples, some couples, and a lot of widows and widowers. He had 3,000 people. He had 5 weekend masses, 6 weekend masses, 4 daily masses. The daily masses, 150 to 200 people at each mass, right? The Sunday collection when he went there was $37,000. Right? 10 years later, same number of people, the collection was $17,000. How come? And this priest could get money out of a turnip. I mean, so it wasn't that he couldn't do fundraising anymore. What happened? It was a different cohort of senior citizens, right? When he went there, the senior citizens he had were born in the 19-teens and 20s. The 10-year difference, it was the ones born in the 30s and 40s. His successor, who is now there, has the same number of people, and the collection is $7,000. That generation wasn't raised to sacrificial giving whatsoever. So even if you maintain the same number, precisely because the formation of the people has not been the same, the money's just not there anymore. So comments about, we'll take a little bit of a break, but questions, comments, yeah.
Yeah, would you repeat a point that you made? It had to do with homeschooling. And it was a point and expand on a little bit. Homeschooling can't do.
It was not fulfilling something.
Yeah, it doesn't do ecclesial socialization. Right? And again, I have seen this repeatedly, you know, and Charles will remember this story. When I used to go to the Gaylord Diocese, my big girlfriends in the diocese are the Carmelite nuns at Traverse City, and I would usually stay with them and celebrate daily masses for them. And they have, most of their servers at daily mass are homeschool boys. And my first time there, I'm sitting in the sacristy before mass praying the office, and a kid comes in, walks right past me, goes to the closet for his cassock, puts it on, and stands there. And I said, can we say good morning, Father? And he said, good morning. I said, no, it's good morning, Father. And he said, okay, good morning, Father. Okay. He serves mass, great precision, but when he was pouring the water, he did this thing with, and so after mass, I said, Johnny, you served very, very well. I said, but here's a pointer. We never use elbows, we use wrist. It's an action of the wrist. He went, weeping. He'd never been corrected by anybody outside the home, right? And I know coaches have told me they can tell a homeschool kid on a soccer team because cannot take correction, right? That's at a social level. And in terms of the church, I mean, think about this. If you have a Catholic school and you have a family that's ostensibly devout and, quote, traditional, right? And you're, as a parent, consciously not using the Catholic school, this is an anti-institutional statement. It means church cannot be trusted, all right? All right? Priests, nuns, Catholic school teachers cannot be trusted. Mommy knows best. I know a priest in the South who inherited a parish with a school. He had the only sister in the diocese in a veil, very traditional operation. And when he went there, he started to attract a lot of so-called traditional Catholics. They liked the way he celebrated Mass. He was available for confession. And of course, all their kids were being homeschooled. And so he kind of monitored the thing. And at the end of the first academic year, he was putting into the bulletin, you know, we've got registration for St. Mary's School coming up, enroll your kid, blah, blah, blah. And so he asked the principal, have any of these homeschoolers, parents, put their kids in? She said, no, nobody. So he called a meeting of homeschooling parents. And he said, I understand, you say you love St. Mary's, you like the preaching, you like the traditional form of liturgy that we do here and so forth. Oh, Father, you're wonderful. We love St. Mary's, and we love you. And he said, well, an integral part of St. Mary's Parish is the school. And I'm wondering why you are not using our school. And so one woman said, well, I can't speak for everybody, which of course she knew she was going to. She said, but let me say this. I know that St. Mary's has the highest rating of any school in the state of South Carolina. Sister Veronica is a wonderful, wonderful nun. We know most of the lay teachers. They're very, very nice women. And he said, well, then why are their children not in our school? She said, if Pope John Paul were the principal of that school, we would not send our children to that school. And he said, why? She said, I don't want my children contaminated by those other children. whose parents practice birth control, who do this, who do that. And he said, he said, well, you know, this is not the community of the saved. It's only the community of the redeemed, which means we're all sinners. And if you're uncomfortable with that, then I suggest you find another parish. And they pushed on to another place. But he had about 100 of these, all right? But notice, so it's not even, the old argument was, oh, the Catholic school in the 70s, all kinds of crazy things. You know, my brother lost his faith because of, you know, Sister Kunigunda said something stupid in the religion class, okay? It's not even that anymore. It's that it's the other kids, it's the other families that are the problem. And so it's this, you know, aloofness, this elitism, and this very, very strange notion of what it means to be Catholic, circling the wagons, right? And so I see that as an extreme problem. And I know of parishes, very, very good traditional type parishes, that had to close their school because the preponderance of the families were homeschooling. So it's not just the problem of the so-called public school, it's also this other fifth column within the church that needs to be addressed.